Today we're going to be talking about meetings and teamwork and effective practices in organizational communication. Now, I know that if you are a student, you often say, "I don't like teams, I don't like teamwork." But as you go through this presentation and consider these, I want you to kind of have this dualistic hat of both thinking yourself as a student and what might you do more effectively in your teams as a student, but more importantly, even as a future leader who's responsible for leading teams and running meetings in an effective manner. Now, there are some definite values to having meetings. They are a common place to announce organizational changes and keep members up to date. They're a place to produce solutions and increase voices contributing to those solutions. So versus having a small group of people, when you bring everyone together, especially if there's an organizational problem, you can work through these things. You also gain buy-in of a decision that's being made because of this participation. Often on a team, there is a smaller group who's going to ultimately make the decision, but that decision maker has heard the voices of everybody present, and therefore they know that they have at least had their voice heard and are more likely to buy in. And as we talked about last week, meetings are a very important part of cultivating culture and creating group cohesion. So the actual getting together physically is important. As we've discussed in this class, face-to-face doesn't necessarily have to mean in person. So with today's technology of Zoom, we can get together. However, if the camera is off, it's not face-to-face. It may be in the same space, but we're not able to actually see one another. So these are all values. Now, there are many reasons why people are pessimistic and frustrated about the whole concepts of having a meeting because of what happens during the meeting. Members that leave the room to take an urgent call. If somebody says, "Oh, sorry, I have to get this," that's telling the group whatever is happening here is not as important as what's happening for me personally, that I might need to step out. Or using phones during the meeting. So whether it's me teaching or you giving a presentation, if you look out at your audience and you see people scrolling through their phones, not to look up something that is related to what you're doing, but something completely different, this can be frustrating. Members arriving late and then wanting to chit chat and have that what should be maybe the pre-time. Those of you that have me in a face-to-face class know that I am almost always in the classroom 5 to 15 minutes early, and often 3 to 5 minutes before class officially starts. I kind of start the chit chat portion, the warm up portion, so that at the start of the time, we can begin the business at hand. And it is frustrating as people walk in late. Now, if there's a legitimate reason for being late, of course, that's understandable. But we've kind of created this culture of lateness, which is frustrating to people that are on time, because then that's where you get the question like, "You may have covered this before I got here, but," and you spend more time on things later on. And finally, meetings just for the sake of having meetings. I think this is something that we have explored ad nauseum during the 3 months or the 3 semesters of remote learning thus far in COVID, during this pandemic, of scheduling meetings in order to keep people busy, or we need to have a monthly meeting or a weekly meeting for this task, even though we don't know why we need to have it. And that can be frustrating for people. Now, there are primary and secondary tensions that occur in new groups. Primary tensions are when groups first congregate or formed. Many of these you may relate to as students. but it is important, like I said, in that dualistic hat, when you become a leader and you know you are leading a team who are going to have to get together in groups, to know that these primary tensions are going to exist. And then we'll talk about how you might mitigate them. So maybe somebody's previous experience in teams has been negative. They say, every time I'm in a team, this, and this happens. One of those things is this very next thing. One member feels they will carry the burden of the group's responsibility. So great, we're in a team, but we all get one grade. That isn't much different, and I know students don't like to hear that in the real world you will do this, but if your end goal is to win a client and you're all working on a pitch together, whether the distribution of work is egalitarian or one person does carry more of the work, whether or not you get that client reflects on the whole team. And often the boss doesn't care how you got to that end goal. It's the matter of what you did there. But this can cause primary tension at the very beginning. Another source of tension is if the topic or end goal is vague, and this causes anxiety, or the topic is clear and the topic itself causes anxiety. As a professor, this is something I try to be aware of. Often I will tell groups, my gender class is a good example of here's your project, but I don't want you starting on it till week 6 or 7 because you need more content. In my activism class, I tell them from the beginning, this whole thing is going to be vague in nature until you create something, because it is the process of learning how to create and how to do. But different amounts of instruction can cause different anxiety for different people. If you know that the topic could be triggering, addressing that up front and finding out what people's issues may be and how to mitigate those as a leader is important. This past week in my family class, I had to do that because this is our trauma challenge. And I recognize that we are all going through trauma of different types right now. And so I asked students privately if there were any individual triggers they wanted to disclose to me, that they could do that. And I would attempt to keep those out of their trauma challenge. The next two are a little bit different than the first three. So the fourth primary tension is when the culmination of the work requires either written or speech skills that the member is not comfortable with. So this is, if you think of the typical group project, where the end might be a class presentation, it's not doing the work leading up to the presentation that causes anxiety or tension. It's the knowledge that at the end, either a paper is due or a presentation is due, and that is what the person does not feel comfortable with. That is the purpose of you doing your skills assessments in this class, is to see where are your weak points and what employers might be looking for, and what can you do to strengthen those. And the last one is probably the toughest, because it involves personal mitigation that a leader may have trouble with or not even know about. But personal issues or other projects seem more important at the time. And this is what I as the leader to students often try to impart. To some people in school is the most important thing. To other people in school is important, but there are other things, either work or family or personal crises or things that are going on, that are actually more important at that time. So the individual has to make the choice to maybe put 70% into their desired effort into the team project, because more effort needs to go into something else. And so this is a hard part of being a leader, is managing people's individual needs in conjunction with the team needs, because you may not even know what those needs are. Secondary tension is stress and strains that develop later in group development. So this is once the group process has started. These can be procedural, which is how it's being done, or the lack of a process altogether, meaning if I give you every other week to work as a group and I give you valuable class time, the only reason I give valuable class time to groups is that I recognize that students are busy and that might legitimately be the only time that you can all get together. It is frustrating for me as a leader if I log into a group Zoom 50 minutes into a 2-hour time block and they say, well, we were done for the day. We did everything we needed to do, but then later they're struggling with the group process. What that often shows me is they went into that meeting without a plan. They went into that meeting not knowing what they were going to do, so they kind of broke up and split off and did something else, which may or may not be effective. The next secondary tension is equity. Equity comes in two ways. You probably learned this in group dynamics if you took that as an elective, but the idea of social loafing, which we've already alluded to in the primary fear of knowing this is going to happen, this is it actually happening. Somebody saying, I'm going to ride the coattails of my group towards success. I will often tell people, do not lower your bar to what other people are choosing not to do. There's a question of fairness there. But if you do that throughout your life in any moment of reducing your effort to what is fair based on others' effort, little will get done. A more significant thing I've seen lately with equity is marginalization. When somebody is not contributing, I will often try to do some one-on-one coaching as the leader. And what is it being expressed to me is that somebody not contributing feels like once they log in or once they start working with a group or listen to their team members, they feel like their team members have great ideas and they can't contribute because they can't contribute anything better, or all their ideas are being shot down and the group has kind of formed a coalition outside of them. And so why even contribute when they're not going to be heard or seen anyway, which can then cyclically lead to an idea from the other group members that that person is social loafing. So that the one problem can lead to the other. Effective, we talk about effective exchange in different communication contexts. These are the negative relationships that form and what we put on one another. These are our coping methods of how we get through the group process. It may be through complaining, it may be through avoiding, but the strain itself of the negative relationship causes a breakdown. Now, there can also be substantive tension, and this is the positive conflict. This is what happens when there are strains in a group and the group works through them. And again, this is not an entire group dynamics class, but in there you probably learned the forming, storming, norming, and performing idea, getting through that storm in order to establish your norms as a group, which establishes culture, and then you perform well. So working through the fight, and that positive conflict can create something meaningful in the end. There are some counterproductive group tendencies. Groupthink is one I think you've all heard of in different places and different times. We talk about it a lot in communication. In the simplest of terms, groupthink is going with the first idea presented or the first best idea presented with little discussion. This often happens in really high performing groups where you have a lot of really intelligent, smart, diligent people. So the first idea might sound like a great idea. But you go with this and you fall into groupthink without ever having someone question what might go wrong if you go with this idea. Or even though this idea is a great idea, is there another great idea that should be considered? The Asch effect, which comes from the research of Solomon Asch, looks at this idea of group conformity, and somebody acquiescing to the idea of the group, even if they don't think the group is right. Asch, in his experiments, would have a group of 9 to 12 graduate students, and they were to compare one line to another group of lines and decide which line was the same length. And but what the people in the group, what one person didn't know is everybody was in on the experiment except that one person, and they would all pick the wrong line, and then that one person would acquiesce to agreeing to the wrong thing because the group majority had agreed to it. And that is the Asch effect. I see this in professional settings all the time, where I can tell by someone's nonverbals that they do not agree, but they do not articulate that agreement because they're like, well, if everybody else thinks this, then this must be the way we should go. The last one here is goal lining. And I have this actual picture of the soccer ball going into the goal. And this doesn't intrinsically feel wrong. The goal lining is where at the beginning of the process, you're thinking solely about the end goal. But defining what that end goal is important. And I'll use the example of how goal lining is done wrong, in my opinion, by students all the time, where the end goal is to get an A. The goal is to get through the semester, to finish and be done with it. That's the goal. But if that's the goal, the route to there might not involve the proper learning or the advancement of techniques and skills and abilities. And so you don't really walk out of the class with more than you came into it, even if you got an A, which was your goal. If your goal at the end is able to be flexible as you learn, and this is something I stress in my activism class all the time, as you have an initial, we're going to work on the environment project. Like your group decides we're going to work on environmental issues. As you do your research, as you learn more about activism, as you learn more about these techniques and the application of communication to those techniques, your goal may shift because you've engaged in a process of learning and discussion, rather than saying we have to stick to the goal that we originally set. Now, there are some interventions that a leader can engage in, or a group can engage in. The first one is called buzz groups. I put breakouts here because in Zoom, that's what we're using. But say you have a group of 10, 12, 14, 28, 32 people, whatever this is, you put people into smaller groups. I, as a communication scholar, would argue that a group needs to be at least 3. You could put people into teams of interpersonal dyads if you want 2s, but you put people into groups so that they have a smaller collective and then bring their conclusions from those breakouts back to the larger team. The next one here is brainstorming, where everyone has an opportunity to put their thoughts into the process. This is polling in the world of communication and brainstorming, where the leader is then going to say, everybody gets an opportunity to put in after the brainstorming session what they think the best is. Peggy McIntosh, in her SEED work, SEED stands for Seeking Educational Equity and Diversity, talks about the autocratic distribution for time for the democratic use of time, meaning that if we're in this circle, everyone gets, say, 2 minutes, and we actually have in these meetings, in these SEED meetings I went to, in these trainings, we'd actually have a clock, and that 2 minutes was that person's time, whether they talked or not, but for everybody else just to listen. When the time's up, you go to the next person. But this idea of everybody's voice coming in. This can lead to a nominal group technique. The nominal group technique is a function in which you break into smaller groups, but not to break out, but to actually get different parts of a problem accomplished. So you really say, okay, yeah, she put this in teams of 10, but there's 5 things we need to do. So let's each break into teams of 2 and do these problems. There is a problem with this type of intervention, that while the group might get the work done, each individual team doesn't know what the other's doing, and so it may not feel cohesive at the end. So if you're going to utilize this type of intervention for teamwork, you want to make sure that there are either liaisons or meeting points along the way where everybody is on the same page. A problem census is a tool in which people can actually revisit what is going on inside the group. So set checkpoints where you say, okay, how are we doing? Reevaluate, realign, and that you don't just assume that everything's going right, which is often helped by engaging in risk technique. And many times in other parts of communication, we will talk about this as having a devil's advocate, but this is actually somebody assigned to the group project to question what it is the group is doing. Now, having a devil's advocate doesn't mean you question every single thing, but it means at points along the way, when a decision is made quickly, that person says, okay, but what if? What if we do this? What could go wrong? What if we make this decision? This might happen. And is that what we want to do? I'm just bringing it up, just playing devil's advocate. That's the risk technique. In this, there's something called a general procedural model, which is if you are starting the process of being a group leader, this is a really good model to use to identify and clarify the reason why you are getting together, to brainstorm, evaluate, then select what it is you're going to do. And then once that selection is made, work towards it actually creating impact versus just getting done. Okay, so you see where that last step is different than the end goal being just finishing, but the end goal being finishing with something productive. Now, as a leader, there are responsibilities in leading this group. You need to be organized going in, you need to start on time, and you need to stay on task. This can be hard if you have an open forum where people can participate. Specifically, if in that participation, people are allotted a non-specific amount of time. This is where the summarizing and soliciting other opinions about what someone has said is important. And the ability to curtail, meaning to stop conversations that are so far off point, they should not be part of that discussion, so that you can conclude on time. One of the most important parts of the leadership responsibility happens after the meeting, where there is a debrief of what went right and wrong. This can happen with a smaller team or even just as an individual. As an instructor, when I'm doing live lectures, I debrief myself in my notes, things that I liked, things that I didn't like. Maybe there was a question that was asked that had never been asked before. I make a note of that and think about if I want to do further research and change something the next time I give this presentation. If I'm working with a GTA, we will often debrief to say, okay, what went well, what didn't go well, what we want to do, and reevaluate for the upcoming semester. In collective presentations, and this is a part of the group process that that you will participate in throughout your professional career, and that you often participate in and possibly dread in your academic career. There are three different kinds. Now, the last one, the team presentation, is what most student groups go to when they hear they're going to give a group presentation. This is the collaborative experience. If you're going to give a team presentation, there should be a clear introduction, that the content is comprehensive so you look like experts in the area. Each should know what the other person is going to do. Transitions are set, but feel fluid to the audience. So you know how you're pushing from one person to the other, and there is a set conclusion so you know where you're closing. One of the things I enjoy in a weird way, but also dread, is when I watch a group and the body language of the group tells me either I am uninterested in what my teammate is currently saying, or I am annoyed by how much time my teammate is taking because we have a time limit and this person is going over. That's why practice for a team presentation is so important, as essential, both as an individual for your part, then as a collective for the group part. Two other types of collective presentations, which certainly could be done in a scholarly presentation, but are actually the most common in the professional world and that I take part in now, are either panel discussions or symposias. So a panel discussion is where you have a group of individuals, each of whom is an expert in a different area. So I might be invited to be an expert in communication and conflict, or someone else is an expert in something else. And we discuss a common theme as experts in different areas. The symposia is where you're experts in the same area to give different perspectives on the same thing. And this is usually moderated. Both of them are usually moderated, but not always. Sometimes the moderator in a panel discussion is part of the panel itself. A symposia is usually moderated by someone who maybe doesn't have expertise at all, except that their expertise is moderation. But here you're experts in the same area, but maybe look through a different lens or have a different research background or different experiences that you want to share. And I'm going to come back to this in just a minute. This past week, I had the opportunity to go to an hour-long NACE employer panel. This is one of the foundations for you doing your portfolio analysis. So I've listed these here again for you to look at, but this is not new. You should have been working on these the whole time. As review, NACE stands for the National Association of Colleges and Employers. And this past week, there was a panel of employers that came to talk to a group of about 100 professors that are actively using NACE. Now, I'm using this in this class, but in my gender class this semester, we were actually doing a pre and post test measuring equity and inclusion in how students feel they came in versus how they leave based on the content we're discussing. I took notes during this presentation. It was not a presentation I was participating in. I was simply listening to the employers, and it was being moderated by Career Services. But I took some notes on what these employers, and I'm going to give you the names of the employers on the last slide, as well as some contact information, what the employers said new hires must have or be able to do. One, at the interview, they have to have done their homework on the organization. The reason for applying can't be because they've always wanted to work in PR or do this thing, but actually speak to why they want to work for that organization. They know the history of it, they know the goals of it, and then also to articulate what they want, that they really want to work for that organization, what their goals are. This comes back to the kind of that classic, where do you see yourself in 5 years? But this is really important to employers now, that they know that people coming in with little experience have thought about their long range plans, especially because loyalty to organizations is less now than it used to be. So just moving up the company ladder is less important. Employers are looking for employees that can articulate what their future goals are. They want young, new employees to be able to see past inclusion as a buzzword, but bring ideas in to what creating a more inclusive environment might look like, and have strong soft skills. Soft skills is the industry language for communication skills. Can you write? Can you speak? Can you do these things? The things that I have is your communication competencies. The employers at this panel unanimously agreed they can teach you whatever they need to teach you about the job and the company, but they can't teach you the soft skills. So if you do not know how to speak to a client, if you do not know how to write proficiently or in an interesting way, they don't have time to teach you that. I've highlighted some of these in red because these were the ones that were the hot buttons of discussion during this. They said, especially because of what they have learned during the pandemic, the ability to manage one's own time is absolutely essential. And having examples of how in a very busy life with lots of trauma and conflict and flexibility, what are your skills and what are your tactics to self-manage your behavior in your time? They talked about that, every employer at length, that you should be able to articulate how you engage in time management and the ability to work in groups. Now, what was interesting is all of the employers agreed that when they were in college, they did not like group work because they thought they were going to end up doing the most of the work. But what they realized once they were on the job is the most difficult groups they were in college prepared them the best for the work that they needed to do once they were on the job. And this makes sense because when things are going well, things are going well. When things are going terribly, you have to engage in tactics in order to get back on track. They talked about engaging in critical thinking without being prompted, having examples of previous leadership, which is, of course, part of your course project in here. And these last two I thought were interesting. They talked a bit about being more professional than is required. So knowing the culture of the organization, but then being more professional than that. And they gave some horrible examples of how people during Zoom interviews now will be going through a drive-through or just woke up or are not prepared at all or don't get dressed up or this idea. So they said, however professional you think you need to be, add something onto it. So this is the reverse of Coco Chanel's advice of put everything on and take one thing off. They're saying be prepared and then add another layer of preparation. And the last one was a willingness to continue to learn, knowing that you don't know everything, but you want to know more and you're inquisitive in the process. So these were the employers that were at this panel. You have the hard copy of this presentation. You can take a screenshot of it as well. I was incredibly impressed with all of the presenters. Kimberly Woods stressed that the majority of their new teachers often do not have degrees in education, and I can speak to this directly that I have many communication majors that have become teachers, and so she implored us all to encourage our students, regardless of their background, to think about education, which is so important right now, especially strong communicators, because the flexibility of communication is what has, or inflexibility of communication is what has caused a lot of teachers to leave. Terrence from HP1 really focused about the importance of internships in his college relations program. Enterprise Holding also has a really strong managerial program out of school. We all know about Disney, but this is actually a recruiter for Disney programs showed up. And I will say that Cintas Kara Howard was probably the most impressive to me, probably because I knew the least about the organization going into this presentation. But she is basically, we would have in my day called this a headhunter. I don't know that we're calling that anymore. A talent acquisition manager. But what she talked about with Cintas is she's looking for raw talent that can be developed through basically an 18-month management preparation once you're hired and then placed into higher level management in different areas. So it was absolutely fascinating. I would encourage you to look into some of these possibilities and even reach out to some of these hiring managers or talent acquisition managers for either internships or if you're graduating responsibilities, and share your portfolio that you're creating through this class with them to show them what it is you can do and what you can bring to the organization.